Born in January 1946, Roger Keith Barrett grew up in Cambridge in a middle-class neighborhood. The name Syd was a nickname he picked up in his teens. As a boy, he was creative, clever, rambunctious, impulsive, and extremely precocious artistically and musically. The only dark cloud in his youth was the untimely death of his father, a prominent pathologist at the age of 52 from cancer. Syd was only 15 years old when his father died. His painting was meticulous and displayed both a sense of discipline from his long training as an artist, as well as a sense of creative freedom. Syd's music was much more free-form and improvisational. It's clear that he saw himself as a serious artist and that music was more for fun. However, when he moved to London at the age of 18 to begin art school at the Camberwell College of Arts, he immediately formed a band with his childhood friend from Cambridge, Roger Waters. Syd named his band the Pink Floyd Sound by cleverly combining the names of two obscure blues musicians. The name was later shortened to Pink Floyd. Syd and his bandmates found that by combining musical and visual effects together, the band created a new experience of combined light and sound that was far greater than the sum of its parts. In the early years of Pink Floyd, Syd was more than just the leader of the band, he was the band. People took to referring to Syd as Pink. Syd was the lead singer and lead guitarist, and he also wrote nearly all of the songs and came up with nearly all of the musical ideas. Syd transposed his avant-garde approach to visual art into music. He was always experimenting with different sounds, just as he was always experimenting with different colors and figures in his painting. Roger Waters noted the painterly quality of Syd's songwriting, the surreal imagery and observational stance he tended to adopt, like a passive eye, taking everything in. He seemed to think of music in more visual than auditory ways, a blending of the senses known as synesthesia, a common trait among poets and artists, and also one of the primary hallucinogenic effects of LSD. In the studio, he'd say things like, "Perhaps we could make the middle darker, and maybe the end a bit middle afternoonish. At the moment, it's too windy and icy." Syd was a precocious artist, and his talents were recognized and nurtured when he was quite young. However, Syd never invited and rarely acknowledged compliments on his work. He painted for himself, and his paintings were ends in and of themselves. Though his teachers began exhibiting his work when he was still in junior high school, he rarely went to the gallery exhibitions. Syd's sister, Rosemary, explained that recognition was just never a necessity for him at all. He did it for himself, for his needs. He never did a commission. He just didn't understand why anybody would want that. A friend from art college described Syd as very sensitive, wild, but sensitive, much more in a world of his own. Mick Rock, a photojournalist and a friend of Syd's, went to his first Floyd concert in December 1966. He described it as unprecedented. There had not been a sound like this before, he recalled. And it was definitely the Syd Barrett band. The rest of the band have always been very gracious about acknowledging that. There he was, bobbing up and down amid the bank of flashing lights. We felt right then that we were the children of the future, and Syd was certainly at the tipping end of that. He was bright, beautiful, a visionary, and very friendly. My abiding memory of Syd is that he laughed a lot. In 1967, during the acid-drenched Summer of Love, Syd's hallucinogenic drug use spiraled out of control. Syd was doing great in May of 1967. recording at Abbey Road and performing some of his best work, including the studio tracks for two of his greatest songs, See Emily Play and Bike, and performing at what was considered to be Pink Floyd's most brilliant live show of their psychedelic period, the Games for May concert in the Queen Elizabeth Hall. However, by early June, music producer Joe Boyd, who had worked with the band, knew something had gone terribly wrong. Earlier in 1967, Syd seemed happy-go-lucky. But a couple of months went by when people talked about Syd taking an awful lot of acid. I saw him at the end of that period, sitting in a London street, and he'd lost all that spark. He became vacant-eyed. The Syd that I knew vanished from this earth that spring of 1967. He was a great and very, very talented guy. And that guy went away a long time ago. Boyd wasn't the only one who observed that the twinkle in Syd's eye had gone out and that the bounce in his step had disappeared. Syd was simply gone. Rick Wright, Syd's bandmate and roommate at the time, recalls that he totally damaged himself beyond repair. He had gone away for a long weekend, and when he returned, there was a total difference. A total difference. Rick said that with acid, I believe he took a huge overdose. There was a huge change, and then he'd gone. Apparently, sometime between May and June of 1967, Syd had a lost weekend from which he never completely returned. While the Summer of Love was going full tilt, the biggest psychedelic pop act in London was canceling all of its shows because its frontman was suffering from quote-unquote nervous exhaustion. His ebullient and effervescent personality were gone, replaced by a withdrawn, frightful, dark, brooding figure who saw and heard things others didn't see and spoke in riddles others didn't understand. He was perpetually lost in time and space, never quite knowing where he was, how he got there, and what he was supposed to be doing. His eyes, once sparkly and full of whimsy, were now empty, replaced by a blank gaze that seemed like, to borrow an expression from Roger Waters, black holes in the sky. On stage, he would often just stare blankly into the crowd, his arms hanging motionless at his side, or maybe just slowly strumming the same chord for the whole show. One time, he completely detuned his guitar in the middle of a number and simply strummed the loose strings, creating no audible sound at all. Mick Rock recalled that Syd was living at an infamous address at that time in London, 101 Cromwell Road, a dubious location known for harboring lots of drugs and lots of damaged people. It was a major burnout joint, Mick Rock recalled. Definitely acid overload there. By November of 1967, Pink Floyd and their managers had to admit that Syd had gone over the edge. Their American tour, opening for Jimi Hendrix, was aborted, and the band returned to England with their tails between their legs. David Gale, Syd's childhood friend, was utterly shocked when he met Syd around that time. This angelic boy became this 1,000-yard stare, sullen black bags under the eyes, pale, listless, not talking, moody, impossible to work with, violent man. By the beginning of 1968, Syd's behavior had become so unpredictable and erratic that he was unmanageable and could no longer function as a member of the band. Pink Floyd has skyrocketed to pop stardom on the strength of Syd's songs, the power of his personal charisma, and the force of his musical creativity, both on stage and in the studio. How could they go on without the wellspring of Syd's unique and original ideas? The presumption, though nobody will ever know for sure, was that Syd had been traumatized and terrified by a massive bad trip brought on by a probable overdose of LSD. Pete Townsend of The Who was on the scene at the time, and he surmised that Syd was someone with psychotic tendencies who, by using too much LSD, pushed himself over the edge. Remember that LSD, Pete explains, was developed for use in psychiatry in clinical circumstances. I only used acid a few times, Pete recalls, and I found it incredibly disturbing. I have certain psychotic tendencies and found it extremely dangerous for me. The band was looking for help with Syd, and R.D. Laing appeared at the time to be Syd's best chance for recovery. The Scottish psychiatrist was all the rage in London at the time for his pioneering theories on psychosis and his revolutionary treatment models. Laing believed that subduing psychosis with powerful antipsychotic drugs was not at all helpful to the patient, and possibly detrimental, because psychosis was simply the patient's mind's way of reacting to the situation of being forced to exist in an insane environment. A perfectly rational adjustment to an insane world. As Syd's problems seemed to emanate from the introduction of a powerful psychoactive substance into his brilliant yet fragile brain, there was a natural hesitancy to try to solve the problem by introducing yet another powerful psychoactive substance, such as the crude antipsychotic drugs in use at the time. Pink Floyd wanted the old Syd back. But even if they could just get his creativity back, if not his ability to perform on stage, then Syd could become the Brian Wilson of the band, writing and composing songs in the studio, while the band toured, with David Gilmour replacing Syd on lead vocals and guitar. Adding even more drugs to his drug-addled brain, which was and is the standard psychiatric treatment for schizophrenia, was probably more likely to drive Syd's ego even further into himself and stifle his creativity. The band and its managers spoke with Laing, describing Syd's symptoms and even playing him a recording of Syd's incoherent and disjointed speech. One valid point that Laing raised to the group was the question, is this really Syd's problem, or is the problem with your expectations for Syd? Nick Mason recalls. In an interview, Nick Mason said that Ronnie Laing listened to the symptoms and asked, "Are you sure these are Syd's problems, rather than the band's problems with Syd?" Which was good for all of us to hear. In other words, maybe Syd just wanted to paint and do his own thing, while all the pressures of having to be a pop star, with the relentless touring, recording, interviewing, and media appearances, were not his thing at all. Laing's point was relevant. The pressure of stardom and success was no doubt a factor in Syd's deteriorating mental state. While the band were truly trying to help Syd, they were trying to help Syd function within the band, as opposed to helping Syd function as a person. However, it was clear to all who knew Syd that the complete change in his personality and the total alteration in his way of being were sudden, severe, and clearly linked to hallucinogenic drug abuse. Roger Waters believed that Syd was indeed schizophrenic, and that the hallucinogens Syd had been overusing, hash, marijuana, and acid, precipitated a psychotic break. Everyone else, including R.D. Laing, more or less agreed. In Rick Wright's recollection, the band did meet with the psychiatrist Ronnie Laing, and that Laing's opinion of Syd's situation was that it was hopeless. The question of whether Syd would have become psychotic had he not done hallucinogenic drugs is a question that could never be answered, probably not even by Syd himself. The fact is that hallucinogens widen the doors of perception within the mind, creating a precarious mental state of derealization, depersonalization, delusional thinking, loose associations, and intense hallucinations. A state of substance-induced psychosis that, neurologically, is exactly the same as organically originated psychosis. It's quite possible that neurological connections that should not have been kindled at that time in Syd's brain development were stimulated in such a way by his recurrent hallucinogenic drug use that the connections related to the psychedelic experience, which should only have had a temporary effect on the brain, corresponding to the duration of the chemical effect of the drug, were, in Syd's case, made permanent. Was this due to Syd's overuse of hallucinogens, or was it due to an underlying vulnerability to schizophrenia? Well before his psychotic break, Syd did show some of the behavior patterns often associated with schizoid and schizotypal personalities. He was always very eccentric and peculiar. The musician Robin Hitchcock noted that in one of Syd's most brilliant songs, Bike, the refrain, "You're the kind of girl that fits in with my world," expresses a rather schizoid point of view. I like you, but you will have to come into my world to be with me. The average age of onset for schizophrenia in males is around 21 years of age. Syd was 21 years old when his severe psychosis led his bandmates to try to get him psychiatric treatment with R.D. Laing. Dr. Laing made it clear to Pink Floyd that his treatment model cannot be imposed on a reluctant patient. He would refuse to treat Syd unless he was a willing participant in the therapy. Syd flatly refused, so that was that. What follows is my personal conjecture as to how R.D. Laing may have applied his distinctive theories of psychosis and treatment models to Syd's case, had Syd actually agreed to be treated by him. The conjecture is derived primarily from Laing's classic book, The Divided Self, an existential study in sanity and madness. In his book, Laing referred to ontological security as the basic sense of confidence in the realness of one's existence. The realness of our existence must be held as a constant reality that is so true that it could never be questioned. Not because the question is irrelevant, but because the question is too relevant to be asked. If your perceptions are not your own, if the voices in your head are unrecognizable as the voice of your own consciousness, then who exactly is in your mind? Who is inhabiting your body and your identity? Whose thoughts are you thinking? And whose life are you living? The unity of self is a precious illusion that we all need to maintain every moment of the day. The loss of that illusion, in Laing's model, is the defining central element of psychosis itself. LSD, a drug we often associate with the creation of illusions, is dangerous precisely because of its potential to dispel illusion. The central illusion that must never be dispelled. I am real. I am one. If he had treated Syd, Laing was likely to have concluded that LSD abuse had the effect of dissolving Syd's ontological security, leaving his psyche precariously detached and untethered to the grounding forces of real experience. Such an individual, in Laing's words, has come to live in a world of his own, because the outside world no longer affects him as it does others. External reality now seems entirely unreal, prefabricated, fake, completely unconnected to the very real and relatable internal world. A psychotic reversal in which inner fantasy becomes more real than external reality. When the illusion of existence is flipped, the outside world must be held at a distance, lest its inherent unrealness invades the safe internal place, destroying him from the inside out. As an instinctual defensive response, the schizoid retreats autistically into his inner world for safe harbor. The outer world is then shut out because the connection to it has become too tenuous, and the ontological risk of venturing out again and losing oneself completely has become too great. In Laing's words, the world of his experience comes to be one he can no longer share with other people. Laing delineated 3 existential anxieties experienced by the ontologically insecure person: engulfment, implosion, and petrification. Engulfment is revealed in a sense of dread towards relatedness with others because of a basic fear of losing one's sense of autonomy and identity. The main maneuver used to preserve identity under pressure from the dread of engulfment is isolation. Implosion, according to Laing, is the terrifying experience of feeling that the veil of ego that separates the self from the world has dissolved, leaving the individual's psyche defenseless and bared open to an external reality that he can no longer relate to or feel safe in. In this decompensated state of defenselessness, his greatest fear is the unwanted intrusion of the outside world into his private inner sanctum, just as a gas will rush in and obliterate a vacuum. Reality, as such, threatening engulfment or implosion, is the persecutor. The journalists who attempted to interview Syd in those days all noted the obvious fear in Syd's eyes. Aubrey Poe Powell, a friend of the band and co-designer for most of their album covers, recalled that he was living at Egerton Court in 1967, where he and his friends were taking quite a lot of LSD. Syd Barrett came and joined them. He'd been booted out of Pink Floyd because he was being too difficult and too uncontrollable. Poe remembers that Syd was frightening. His eyes were black. There was a fear that emanated from him. In an interview for Rolling Stone magazine, Mick Rock reported that Syd was living in his own private world, and that he looked hollow-cheeked and pale, with eyes reflecting a permanent state of shock, a ghostly beauty one associates with the poets of old. Syd told Mick that he was disappearing, avoiding most things, treading the backward path. "I'm full of dust and old guitars," he admitted. Petrification, according to Laing, is the fear of being turned from a live person into a dead thing, into a stone, into a robot, an automaton, without personal autonomy or action, an it without subjectivity. The ego-defenseless individual's greatest fear is to be the object of another person's awareness, because visibility exposes his unshielded inner self to the critical eye of deconstructive reality. Invisibility arises as a basic mechanism of defense. In Laing's words, we all employ some sort of camouflage. Thus, to forego one's autonomy becomes the means of secretly safeguarding it. To play possum, to feign death, becomes a means of preserving one's aliveness. To turn oneself into a stone becomes a way of not being turned into a stone by someone else. Jerry Shirley, a friend and fellow musician, recalls a night when he and Syd were hanging out. Syd was talking and acting quite normally, but then they went to a pub, and everybody instantly turned their attention to Syd. According to Shirley, Syd absolutely froze. He wouldn't say a word, and then his mind went off somewhere else. Catatonia is a negative symptom of schizophrenia, in which the individual becomes physically frozen, like a stone. Syd frequently displayed catatonia, sitting or standing frozen in one position for many hours at a time, like a stone. His former manager, Andrew King, recalls how Syd spent an entire night hanging on an overhead beam while he rocked his heels back and forth on a lemonade bottle. He even exhibited catatonia on stage in front of audiences. Pete Townsend noted that Syd was the first person he had seen who was totally gone on stage. When Syd was being edged out of the band, his roommate and bandmate Rick Wright told him that he was just going out for cigarettes, when he was actually going to play a gig with the Floyd. When Rick returned several hours later, he found Syd sitting frozen in the same position that he left him in, with a cigarette that had burned down to the filter between his fingers, a long column of ash indicating that he hadn't moved an inch all night. Rick said, "Hey Syd, I'm back," to which Syd replied, "Oh, did you get the cigarettes?" The image of the petrified man with the long column of ash on his unsmoked cigarette was such a powerful symbol for psychological detachment that Roger Waters used it in the movie Pink Floyd The Wall to represent the state of the protagonist, Pink, who had become comfortably numb. The schizoid individual, in Lang's words, fears a real live dialectical relationship with real live people. He can relate himself only to depersonalized persons, to phantoms of his fantasies. The schizoid's autistic retreat is entirely defensive, so that if, in Lang's words, the whole of the individual's being cannot be defended, he retreats even further into his self, until he withdraws within a central citadel. He is prepared to write off everything he is, except his self. But the tragic paradox is that the more the self is defended in this way, the more it is destroyed. Laing wrote that the illusion of omnipotence and freedom can be sustained only within the magic circle of its own shut-upness in fantasy. And in order that his attitude be not dissipated by the slightest intrusion of reality, fantasy and reality have to be kept apart. But the person who does not act in reality and only acts in fantasy becomes himself unreal. In the unreleased studio track, Vegetable Man, Syd sings, "I've been looking all over the place for a place for me, but it ain't anywhere." Similarly, in the song Jug Band Blues, the last song he recorded with Pink Floyd, Syd directly addresses the condition of his own existence as both a band member and as a person. "It's awfully considerate of you to think of me here, and I'm much obliged to you for making it clear that I'm not here." The resounding question at the center of the song is, "I'm wondering who could be writing this song." In his confused and withdrawn state, Syd did not seem to completely understand that he was gradually being edged out of the band that he had founded, named, and single-handedly made successful. Part of this confusion, no doubt, came from the band's reluctance to say anything directly to Syd about what was going on. Nick Mason recalled that in typical repressed British fashion, things got so bad that somebody almost said something. After his ouster from the Floyd in 1968, Syd was briefly hospitalized in Cambridge for psychiatric care. Later that year, in a tenuous state, Syd recorded The Madcap Laughs. The album provides rare insight into the mind of a man who, in Lang's words, had entered into the schizoid inner world of a relationship that relates only to itself. Despite the lack of anything that could be used as a single, and the complete inability for Syd to tour the album or promote it in any way, as well as the total non-commercial sound of every song on the album, The Madcap Laughs sold copies. Another solo album was commissioned, and Syd was dragged into the studio one last time to record Barrett. The refrain to the song Baby Lemonade seems to sum up the mood of the album. Rain falls in gray far away. Syd's last interview with his friend Mick Rock for Rolling Stone magazine provides a glimpse at his state in 1971. "I wasn't always this introverted. I'm disappearing, avoiding most things. Nevertheless, at one point he declares, I'm totally together. I even think I should be." Syd lived in seclusion for most of the 1970s, staying in expensive flats and hotels in London and overindulging in food, Guinness, drugs, and whatever else he wanted. Continuing royalties from his Pink Floyd and solo recordings only carried him so far. His prodigal ways led to both financial bankruptcy and serious health problems. With the exception of the most infamous surprise visit in music history, when Syd inexplicably appeared unannounced in the studio in 1975 as the Floyd were recording Wish You Were Here, the album inspired by and dedicated to Syd, he never saw his former bandmates again. In 1982, Syd walked home from London to Cambridge, 64 miles, and stayed there for good. He moved into his mother's house, and his mother, unable to handle his moods and erratic behaviors, moved nearby to her daughter Rosemary's house, where she lived with Syd's sister and nieces for the rest of her life. Syd lived on his own in his mother's house for the rest of his life, with brief, intermittent hospitalizations for both medical and psychological reasons. He lived a solitary existence, and his only interactions were with his sister and his mother. He painted a lot, but destroyed most of his paintings, even though he was still famous, and his art could have been sold at auction for considerable income. As always, Syd was completely uninterested in money, fame, or recognition. Since childhood and through the Floyd years, Syd was always primarily interested in creative expression for its own sake. Only from that perspective could we understand the idea of painting a painting and then destroying it. Or, for that matter, creating a rock band and a new type of rock music and then losing interest in being a rock star and simply walking away. Validation and acknowledgement from others may feel good, but it also makes the artist dependent on others for money and recognition, making the art itself dependent and contingent upon the appreciation of others, revoking the freedom of creative expression that inspired the art in the first place. Ironically, destroying your own work as part of the creative process is the only way to maintain complete creative freedom and autonomy. Yet, this level of complete creative freedom is also completely schizoid, as it's made by the self, for the self, with no relation to anything outside of the self. Dougie Fields, Syd's flatmate after he left the Floyd, believed that fame arrived very suddenly and very dramatically for Syd. Because of that, he had to become the performing monkey, on top of the pops and in other shows, and his sense of creativity didn't espouse to that. In an interview, Andrew King, former manager of Pink Floyd and Syd Barrett, said that on stage at the UFO Club or Sound Technics, how completely intense Syd was on his concentration on the music. He was absolutely absorbed in it, like he was playing it only for himself. He later explained that Syd was even then beginning to go into himself, so that you did have to follow him if you wanted to be with him. He explained that Syd was trying to move faster than the rest of the band could, and that at the end of the day, that's why everything went wobbly. The band were fine with doing Top of the Pops, but to Syd, it clearly just felt wrong. Artistically, he wanted to move on. Nobody knew Syd better than his sister Rosemary. They were inseparable as children. They remained close throughout Syd's teens and the Floyd years, and later on, after his mother died, she became his only real connection to the outside world. She states authoritatively that Syd never wanted celebrity, he never understood fame, and he never wanted money. Music was just a hobby for him, a bit of fun, and when it became not fun, which it did very quickly, he left. She's witness to the fact that Syd was always painting, enormous canvases often, twice as big as a television set. He had to get it out of him and onto the canvas. It was a need that he had, she explained. It wasn't just that he enjoyed being creative. It was a need for him. He was compelled to create. In her words, creativity was such a drive for him that it was vital, as much as food and drink. Rosemary verifies that Syd did destroy nearly all of his artworks, usually burning them in the backyard. Perhaps they didn't matter to him, she suggested, once he got it out. Why he did it is because he had a need to make art, but he had no intention of anyone ever looking at it, or he or anybody else ever enjoying it in the future. He did it for himself. Once Pink Floyd was well behind him, nobody in his very small circle of immediate family and neighbors referred to him as Syd or as Pink ever again. He was simply Roger Barrett once more. An eccentric retired musician who was keen on painting and gardening, and who treasured his privacy above all other things. Like his father, he died of pancreatic cancer at a young age, 60. Except for his rather brief tenure as a rock star in London, Syd lived a very quiet and secluded life in his hometown of Cambridge. His sister Rosemary said that he came to hate the name Syd latterly and what it meant. That's another life for him, another world and another time. He's not Syd anymore. He's Roger. We'll never truly know who Roger Keith Syd Barrett was, as he retreated into his divided self and never fully reemerged, many, many years ago. In one early mixed media montage entitled Divided Self, Syd meditates upon Lang's construct of ontological insecurity, possibly even applying it to his own existential issues, like I've attempted in this video. Perhaps he put it best in his final interview with the cryptic self-observation, "I've got a very irregular head, and I'm not anything that